Welcome to the Analytical Writing Assessment section. So, what is the AWA test all about? In the AWA section, the GMAT wants to find out the overall quality of your ideas, the ability that you have to organize, develop, and express those ideas. Also, the relevant supporting evidence and reasons that you provide. And finally, your ability to control the elements of standard written English. In other words, this section is a combination of everything you've learned in the verbal part. It is critical reasoning because you need to analyze an argument. It is also sentence correction because you need to write down an essay, putting together all the concepts, everything you've learned in sentence correction, from subject-verb agreement to idioms. Finally, it is reading comprehension because you're putting together a passage. You are connecting paragraphs using transition words. And remember, every paragraph you write has a main thesis statement. So, what is the process to write an essay? How do you write an essay? And I have divided the entire process into 5 steps. The first one is to analyze the critical reasoning section. The second part is to do some brainstorming. Think about ideas, think about flaws or weaknesses in the argument. The third step is to do a brief outline, which you will already have in your mind before you sit down to take the exam. The fourth step is to write down. You just need to write an introduction, a body of about 2 paragraphs, and a conclusion. Finally, you need to proofread. The entire process will take you about 30 minutes. You should be done in about 28 though. Okay? So, this is a sample question from a real GMAT exam. And let's read the argument. It says, most companies would agree that as the risk of physical injury occurring in the job increases, the wages paid to employees should also increase. Hence, it makes financial sense for employers to make their workplace safer. They could thus reduce their payroll expenses and save money. As you can see, this is very similar to a critical reasoning argument. And in this section, we'll put together some very important lessons that we learned in critical reasoning, especially assumptions, weaken, support, and flaw. So as you can see below, you have the instructions. It says, discuss how a reason you find this argument. In your discussion, be sure to analyze the line of reasoning and the use of evidence in the argument. For example, you may need to consider what questionable assumptions underlie the thinking and what alternative explanations or counterexamples might weaken the conclusion. You can also discuss what sort of evidence would strengthen or refute the argument. What changes in the argument would make it more logically sound? And what, if anything, would help you better evaluate its conclusion? As you can see, the instructions are very clear and they are the same for every argument. And you can use those lines to your advantage. So, let's apply the concept we saw before. Analyze, brainstorm, outline, write, and proofread. So let's begin with the analysis part. And this is just what we did in critical reasoning. You need to identify either a premise, conclusion, or sometimes you may have a plan with a goal. And the second part is to find as many weaknesses as you can. So, how do you find those weaknesses? Believe me, it doesn't matter how strong or how sound a conclusion may be. It always has flaws. Every single argument has mistakes. So, let's go back to the question. What is a conclusion? Well, the conclusion is clearly stated at the end. You have the word hence, which is a conclusion marker. It says, it makes financial sense for employers to make the workplace safer. Column. Thus, that they could thus reduce their payroll expenses and save money. That is a conclusion. Now, what premise leads to the conclusion? Well, usually is the previous sentence. And before hence, the sentence is that Well, most companies would agree that as the risk of physical injury occurring on the job increases, the wages paid to employees should also increase. Notice that the premise that leads to the conclusion is a claim. And usually, a claim that supports another claim is weak. It's a weak argument. Okay, so let's do some brainstorming. We have three methods. You can use a line-by-line analysis. You can just read the instructions and follow the instructions, or you can focus on common fallacies. I personally prefer method number one, line by line. How does that work? Well, what you do is you start with the first sentence in the argument and ask yourself what is wrong with it. If it is a piece of evidence, how does it fail to prove the bigger point or the conclusion? If it is a claim, how is it not supported by the evidence? So you read sentence by sentence until you finish the argument. Then you can use the instructions. And the instructions, I'm going to go back to them, are written right here. Discuss how well reasoned you find your argument. And the argument is always ill-reasoned. There are always flaws. So, for example, analyze the line of reasoning and the use of evidence. Usually, the author does not provide enough evidence. Okay? Also, it says questionable assumptions. There are always questionable assumptions, at least one or two. Another key part is alternative explanations or counterexamples. Well, an alternative explanation is something the author does not consider as an explanation that could explain whatever happened in the argument. And a counterexample is simply an example that contradicts what the author says. Also, what evidence would strengthen or refute the argument? Well, it's quite important to try to think what the argument is missing. Is there any sort of evidence that could strengthen the argument's conclusion? Okay. Or what would help the author better evaluate his or her own argument? So, the instructions are very useful. And basically, you need to think about the line of reasoning, the use of evidence, questionable assumptions, alternative explanations or counterexamples. And maybe what else does the author need to support his main claim? Okay, so the instructions are very useful and they will be written for you during the exam, so you can just follow them. Another one is to focus on common fallacies, such as alternative causes, survey errors, false analogies, false dilemmas, faulty evidence, maybe unforeseen consequences, or maybe numbers and percentage errors. We went over every single fallacy in the flaw lesson. So you can go back to that lesson to check those. So once you do your brainstorming, it's time to outline the essay. And the outline consists of a brief introduction, a body, and a conclusion. The introduction is a single paragraph. The body should be at least 2 paragraphs. I recommend 3 if you want to get a 6 on this section. Finally, in the conclusion, you just need 1 paragraph. So, how do you write the introduction? What should you add there? It's quite simple. In the introduction, you simply need to paraphrase the argument. And that simply means to restate the premise and the conclusion. Explain those in your own words. Then, clearly state a weakness or weaknesses. And your thesis statement is that the argument is always flawed, is always mistaken. Okay? So you write that in a nice paragraph, as we will see next. Then in the body, you need 2 or 3 paragraphs. Each paragraph will be a weakness or a flaw in the argument. So in paragraph 2, your first point will be maybe a faulty assumption. And you can use a transition word such as first, you mention the flaw, and then you support it with an example. You can make it up. You can make it up. And the third paragraph you write down your second point, which is maybe lack of evidence or maybe lack of statistical information. And again, you write your transition word, maybe second, you explain it, you give an example. Then in the fourth paragraph, you can add a third point, maybe a misinterpretation of data. Okay, and again, you write your transition word, maybe finally, you explain the flaw, you give an example. And finally, in the conclusion, you just need to write one paragraph. You can write in conclusion, to summarize, to conclude any transition word, and then you restate your thesis statement. And again, the thesis statement is that the argument is flawed. The premise does not lead to the conclusion. The conclusion is not supported by the evidence provided. The argument assumes many incorrect things. And you can take advantage to add something that could fix the argument. What does the author need to support his argument? Okay, so the final step is to write the essay. And this is an example from a student who achieved a 6 on the exam, at the top score. So look what the student did. He started with one long paragraph in which he's paraphrasing the argument briefly and he's attacking the conclusion directly. He says, this argument states that. So notice how the student starts paraphrasing the argument. This argument says that it makes financial sense for employers to make the workplace safer because by making the workplace safer, then lower wages could be paid to employees. And then the premise. This conclusion is based on the premise that as the list of physical injury increases, the wages paid to employees should also increase. And then the attack. However, there are several assumptions that may not necessarily apply to this argument. And he gives examples. For example, the costs associated with making the workplace safe must outweigh the increased payroll expenses due to hazardous conditions. Also, one must look at the plausibility of improving the work environment. And finally, because most companies agree that as the risk of injury increases, so will wages, doesn't necessarily mean that all companies which have hazardous work environments agree. So notice that in this introduction, the student is paraphrasing the conclusion, the premise that leads to the conclusion, and then he provides the attack. Okay? And basically an attack is very, very clear. You can attack the assumption, you can attack the premise, you can attack the conclusion. Remember that the assumption is the most important part of an argument, right? It is the bridge that connects the premise with the conclusion. If you attack the assumption, you destroy everything. So then you have the body. In the body, the author mentions the first flaw. Okay, so the first issue to be addressed is whether increased labor costs justify large capital expenditures to improve the work environment. Clearly, one could argue that if making the workplace safe would cost an exorbitant amount of money in comparison to leaving the workplace, as is and paying slightly increased wages, then it would not make sense to improve the work environment. And then the example. For example, if making the workplace safe would cost 100 million versus additional payroll expenses of only 5,000 per year, it would make financial sense to simply pay the increased wages. So notice that example is very clear. That's a counterexample. Okay? No business or business owner with any sense would pay all that extra money just to save a couple dollars and improve employee health and relations. To consider this, a cost-benefit analysis must be made. Okay, that's something the author needs to improve his conclusion, right? I also feel that although a cost-benefit analysis should be the determining factor with regard to this decision-making financial sense, it may not be the determining factor with regard to making social, moral, or unethical sense. Okay, so that's flaw number one, with examples, counterexamples. Okay. Then flaw number two. This argument also relies on the idea that companies solely use financial sense in analyzing and improving the work environment. This is not the case. Companies look at other considerations, such as the negative social ramifications of high on-job injuries. For example, Toyota spends large amounts of money improving its environment because while its goal is to be profitable, it also prides itself on high employee morale and an almost perfectly safe work environment. Notice you can make up these examples, okay? You can even create new names, okay? As long as you support your idea, that's fine. However, contrast, Toyota finds that it can do both, as by improving employee health and employee relations, they are guaranteed a more motivated staff and hence a more efficient staff. This guarantees more money for the business as well as more safety for the employees. Okay, so that's the third paragraph. And finally, that's the last flaw, the fourth paragraph. One must understand that not all work environments can be made safer. For example, in the case of coal mining, you can create these hypothetical situations, okay? So in the case of coal mining, a company only has limited ways of making the work environment safe. While companies may be able to ensure some safety precautions, they may not be able to provide all the safety measures necessary. In other words, a mining company has limited ability to control the air quality within a coal mine, and therefore it cannot control the risk of employees getting black lung. In other words, regardless of the intent of the company, some jobs are simply dangerous in nature. Notice how strong this last paragraph of the body is. Okay, so in the body, we just write 2 or 3 paragraphs. Each paragraph will represent a flaw in the argument with examples. Finally, we have the conclusion. And here you just need to restate the thesis statement. And the thesis is that the argument is flawed, is wrong, is full of mistakes. And then you mention fixes to the argument if you haven't already. So take a look at this conclusion. In conclusion, while at first it may seem to make financial sense to improve the safety of the work environment, sometimes it truly does not make financial sense. Furthermore, financial sense may not be the only issue a company faces. Other types of analysis must be made, such as the social ramifications of an unsafe work environment and the overall ability of a company to improve that environment. For example, the coal mine. Before any decision is made, all these things must be considered, not simply the reduction of payroll expenses. And that was the end of this essay that received a 6 on the exam, on the GMAT exam. Now, about the scoring, 6 means outstanding. You have from NR, which is a blank essay, you didn't write anything, all the way up to 6. Now notice that 6 represents the 88th percentile. Now what score do you really need? The truth is that with 4 and up is enough. And notice that a 4 is a 17th percentile, which means that most people get a 4. And I know that a 4 doesn't look good maybe because, oh, it's 17th percentile, but believe me, 4 means adequate, so it's good enough. As long as you get 4 and above, you are good to go, okay? So, you can download all the official Analytical Writing Assessment questions from the website on the screen. And you can practice with those in our platform, and well, we can correct those essays, give you feedback. But just remember that what we did here is a combination of critical reasoning to analyze the argument, sentence correction to write down sentences without mistakes, and at the end is reading comprehension because you are creating a short passage. Okay? So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. As you notice, you already have developed all the skills needed to ace this section of the exam. So good luck, and I see you soon.